Where I usually like to start in is to get some sense of you as a person, not as the engineer and consummate professional that you are. So that's why I'm starting at the beginning and asking you about when you grew up and the environment that you were in as you were developing your skills and becoming the professional in the audio industry.
Well, I was born in Melbourne. It's Margaret Coles Hospital in Swanston Street. And then we were at the time, very briefly, in St Kilda, I think, Maitland Street, and then went out to a new estate called North Balwyn, which was muddy roads, no sewerage, middle of nowhere. And we didn't have a car and we didn't have a licence or anything, so we got fit. So we spent a fair bit of time there.
Fairly typical, though. It's baby boomer territory.
Oh, most certainly. We were the tail end of the baby boomers. The baby boomers sort of came through with a big peak around probably a year or two behind me after the war. So the earliest record I have of anything electronic would be in Sydney. We moved a lot because my father, Hume, kept getting promoted. And promotion in those days meant oscillating between Sydney and Melbourne with the AMP Society. So we would move to Sydney and then move to Melbourne. Each move involved 3 different locations because you'd move into temporary accommodation somewhere, then you'd buy a house somewhere, then you'd have temporary accommodation before you moved back to Melbourne. Then when you arrived in Melbourne, you'd have temporary accommodation and so on. That was the cycle. So in Sydney in 1959, just before we left for Melbourne again, we made a television set, which was an old Radio, TV and Hobbies, I think, which became Electronics Australia. My job was to hold things until they got too hot to hold, so I wasn't really versed in electronics. But we got it to work, and it was an old 5BP1 persistent phosphor screen. And it was back to front, but it was very linear because it was electrostatic, not magnetic deflection. And it worked. So popular in the street because there were no television sets, but this thing wasn't very bright, and it was a 5-inch screen, 5BP1. For those that don't have it, that's about 12 centimetres. And so we had the neighbours come in and we'd all sit underneath a blanket watching the television to exclude the light. And it probably wouldn't have been good virus territory, but that worked. And then as people got their own television sets, they disappeared. So I don't know whether that inspired my interest in radio and electronics.
You said that your father was interested in electronics, and that was the inspiration.
Yes, he certainly was. He'd gone to Wesley, and when he went there, he had an interest in this, and he was one of the early ham radios, VK3AFH in Victoria, 3 prefix. And he went to the headmaster and said, I'm thinking of going into electronics. And the headmaster said, there's no future in electronics. Get yourself a job in the bank. So he went off and got a job in the bank. But he always had the interest in electronics. He made some excellent equipment, transmitter, receiver. There was a dual-tuned RF stage, regenerative wonderfulness on the receiver. Worked very well. In fact, I reiterated it or repaired it or got it going again. And then one day I went round to his place in his senior years and he dismantled it. I said, what did you do that for? Anyway. Yes, so he was very interested in that and in audio and electronics related to that. For those that remember, and there aren't many, it's the Williamson amplifiers and Wharfdale loudspeakers and Briggs cabinets and all of that. And he loved music. He was very keen on this newfangled jazz. The jazz had sort of appeared in Australia, and he got very interested in that. In the end, he would become the writer of the index for Duke Ellington's book, Music is My Mistress. And he used to drag me along to all these wonderful concerts at Festival Hall.
Mm.
And the concert was great, but afterwards was even better, because in those days the only liquor license that went past probably 6 but maybe 10 p.m. was down at the Musicians Club, which was down in near St Kilda Junction. So we'd go down there after the show, and the whole band would be there. You'd get a proper show, and you could sit next to them and talk to them.
Yeah.
So, well, I suppose you'd call them an orchestra, wouldn't you? But anyway, that was very good. And I got to know Max Hull, who ran Festival Hall. He'd set it up for the Olympics, I think, as one of the venues. And he was still there. He was running East Recording Company over in Canterbury Road. And he was also running the Bio Box. And so in later years, I got to know him because we moved in next door to him in Dryden Street, Canterbury, in a flat.
Oh, okay.
And one morning on Saturday, I heard this magnificent music coming over the fence. And, you normally, there's somebody playing their mantle radio, but I looked over the fence and there were a pair of A7 Voice of the Theatres in the backyard playing the most magnificent recording that he'd just made the night before from Festival Hall. I can't remember who it was, but it was probably Kenny Ball and his Jasmine or something. Magnificent stuff, elfing it out. Anyway, I got to know him and I used to go and help him out in the Bio Box at Festival Hall.
Oh, wonderful. That obviously was part of your introduction to audio as a professional.
Yeah, I don't know whether that was... I'd been doing a lot of hobby stuff, so there was a lot of electronics involved in it. I think most people got involved in all of that, so making things and repairing them. But the plan was that somebody would want some electronics. Usually I got involved with some of the early groups, rock groups I suppose you'd call them, in the 60s, and one of them was called the Executives. I could tell you who was in it, but I'd probably embarrass them, so I won't. But they needed equipment, so I used to get the contract to make amplifiers and loudspeakers and all that sort of stuff. And the deal was you had to buy me a power tool, and that was what it would cost to get the product made. So I had quite a good selection of power tools in those days, mostly Black & Decker, because I don't think the Japanese had got into the market by then. Anyway, so yeah, I'm making those, and I don't know whether you'd say that's professional, but I was getting paid in goods in lieu of.
No, it's an introduction to the world and actually making some use of your expertise in growing an interest in it.
Closing on that, the other one was, it wasn't just going and getting the radio, TV and hobbies or Electronics Australia or ETI or whatever. I used to do all the designs. I doubt whether I knew what I was doing too much, but I did get all of the designs. This is well before I went to university and studied electrical engineering. And so I used to do all sorts of things like tetrodes, wires, triodes, and VR150 regulators for the screens, and fixed bias, and all that.
I remember that. Anyway, your school?
Very, very disrupted because of going to a lot of different places. I went to 8 or 10 primary schools because of the moving. You'd move. Mm.
Did that help or hinder?
I think socially it helped, honestly, because you had to learn how to get along. You had to, in a school environment, there's one of everything, but you've got to be a bit defensive against the one that is the bully, and so on. So I think that was helpful. It meant that there was a very broad selection of people that you knew, but I don't think you'd say, well, I met somebody and they're my friend for life. I don't think that was part of it. And your swapping meant you went into different school levels. So the Sydney-Melbourne thing was always half a year out, and they'd always say, well, put him down or put him up or whatever, and my sister too, same deal. So there was always that misalignment between Sydney and Melbourne with the education. Yeah, it's quite disjoint. We lived for a while. One of the accommodations was a place called King's Cross in Australia, which for those who are seeing this from somewhere else, it was an interesting district. And that was quite educational. As part of
Indeed.
the rural education. Secondary, Melbourne by then, we'd stabilised on Melbourne, and so that was a school that's no longer there, Gardner Central. The Central School went to Year 8, and then Melbourne High School, which went from 9 till 12. Anyway, the school's not there. Then the Melbourne High thing, and then Monash University, and then there weren't any jobs for electrical engineers in 1970, whenever, 4, I think, 5, 4.
What made you choose to go to Monash to do electrical engineering?
There was a choice of 2. I was looking at whether it would be medicine or engineering, because you'd had a bit of human interaction, and engineering doesn't necessarily give you that, but you also had the technical side. So why Monash? I don't know. That was probably the best scholarship. I don't know.
Also,
it was nearby. It was new. It was nearby.
Close
I'm glad
to
I
where you
went
lived.
there because the lecturers were very good.
Well,
It was new when they'd set it up. And
Did they provide the inspiration for your later career? Obviously, you got through the courses.
I kept in. I don't know how to answer that. I kept in touch with the lecturers, and I still do for those that will tolerate me. And as you may cover later, looking at projects with them, and part of the issue there was I'd left the university, but I went back and we said, oh well, I've got an idea, could be complete craziness or whatever. Let's have a look at it. And to start with, that went into the university sanctum, and that was not good, because this was startup, which is a culture that's foreign to a lot of institutions, and it was new tech, which is foreign. It was just not a good match, but the universities understood that intellectual property could have value. So they wanted to own that intellectual property. And it's sort of like, well, I own the Taj Mahal, now I've got to maintain it. Well, I don't think they understood how to maintain intellectual property. I could be wrong, I don't want to offend anybody, but in the end, most, if not all, of the people at the universities have a little bit of flexibility in their employment contracts, because they are marking theses, they're doing PhD student supervision and so on, and that means remuneration from outside that university environment. And so they had the flexibility, and so I'd say, oh, well, let's go and have a bit of fun for a few weeks and do a bit of design work and see if we can get it to work. So taking them out of that environment rather than going into that environment. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people, though. I mean,
when you were studying at university, you came in contact with Ed Cherry and Greg Campbrell. They formed a significant part of your later business environment.
The team was a bit many and varied. Ed was there, and Greg was there. But there was also Doug Lampard, who was the professor of electrical engineering, and he was a great guy. Doug, there's some stories here which I can now tell. Doug Lampard was a brilliant guy, but he used to like picking on a few people, including me. So he'd say, now we've just solved this differential equation for the electric field throughout the space. And if we apply a potential of 0 at the origin, what is the potential here? Huon. And you've got a choice of 3, 0, infinity, or something in between. And I'd always pick the wrong one. He'd just say, no, try again. But he did a lot of work. He developed the reference capacitor, which was one of the things he did, using the Schwartz transform, or Christoffel, maybe it was Schwartz. He did a lot of good stuff, but he used to go down to the pub and play the banjo on Fridays. So we used to go down there and have a bit of fun. Music again.
Music again, it's a big theme.
You graduated eventually.
Yep. Ordinary, plain, common or garden degree. No jobs.
Yes. What then?
Postgrad training in Diploma of Education at Rusden. and then 2.5 years, I'd have to say, working in the education field. I was appointed to the technical schools, which is probably logical. And we had a great time. I was out at a new and innovative school, which you wouldn't think of, which was the Dandenong Middle Level College, which became the TAFE. And we did a lot of what I considered to be the future of educational structure, but it turned out not to be. What we had there was a college which probably had 800, maybe 1,000 kids, probably 80 teachers in various areas. We were in the mathematics and science area, but there was also all the trades and so on. And quite a lot of variation in capability of students. So I did not create this. I came into the environment where there was a group of keen people setting up self-paced learning modules. So it was pre-test, units in multiple forms for the learning experience, close contact with the tutor, lecturer, whatever you want to call them, and then a post-test and individual records and so on. And the only way that could work would be to have block timetable classes. So we used to have classes of 120, and you'd pull up your teachers and you put them into the room, and they'd all be busy. They'd all have their own stuff to do. And it worked. I thought it worked extremely well. They had to learn their cognitive skills, their knowledge skills. They also had to learn their interpersonal or affective domain skills, and they also needed to develop their judgment and fine motor and their physical skills. So it was a balanced program, and it expanded across. I developed it into electronics and physics a bit, but I was also running some night classes. Anyway, it all seemed to be going pretty well, but the problem was timetabling. If ever you've been involved in this, you're going to have to block timetable, and so you're going to have to shuffle amongst all the rooms with all the skills and all the teachers and all the lecturers and all the facilities and all the students. So I got hold of some machine, and Hewlett Packard, probably a 9835 or 25 or something. Anyway, what looked like a desktop calculator was a computer, and wrote some programs to do the scheduling. That was fun. And it all seemed to work.
Well, that built an experience in mathematics that obviously became useful to you in later life. So that was a concrete experience that was relevant, quite apart from the fact that teaching in those areas tends to, in my experience at least, reinforce your skill set that you graduated with your degree from. Did you experience it in that way?
I would probably say that the educational experience was a quite solid but separate stream, because I still do some work in that field, but formally in that field. And then independently of that, the electronics tended to go in the direction of new product development and research and consultancy. So to my mind, they were probably separate streams. Of course they interact. I mean, education is a whole of life experience, but yeah.
And then you got a job at Telstra or Telecom.
Well, probably Telecom. It wasn't the PMG. It was just after it ceased being the PMG, and they split off the letters department, Australia Post. Yes, it was. There hadn't been a call for engineering graduates, and they put out a call probably 76, 77, 76. I don't know. Anyway, around then, and they took on 11 engineers, and I knew all of them because we had to work together. And I've been in touch with some of them, but turned up at Telstra. I'd actually cheated a bit because I had some work with the research laboratories. Telecom ran its own research laboratories, mostly located in the central business district of Melbourne. I don't know how many rabbit warrens they had in there, but they had a lot. And so I'd done the vacation student work because I got married in 72 during our training, and we paid our own way. So I used to have to go and work, get as much as you could, and then live, the usual sort of thing. Yeah, so vacation jobs. And went on to work with telecom when they put out their call for people. Yeah.
And apparently at that time you were working with optical technology.
That was during the research laboratories experiences. We were with a group at number 10 Lonsdale Street, which has been bulldozed many years ago, but number 10 Lonsdale Street was solid state and quantum electronics. Sounds wonderful.
It must have been very early in the technology.
It was very early. We were still looking at this wonderful future technology called optical fibre. It was all wonderful stuff. It was going to happen. We thought it was going to happen, and there was some work done there with all sorts of things. There was liquid filled fibre, but I don't think anybody would think it was viable now. But in those days, we had liquid core fibre. We had just the earliest of the PIN semiconductor diodes detectors. And we used to fabricate all those in number 10 Lonsdale Street. We had diffusion ovens for silicon and gallium arsenide, and we had vacuum deposition equipment and micro positioners and all sorts of things for making up these devices. Because in those days, it could have been local fabrication, but it was pretty clear that the overseas companies were racing ahead with that. So a lot of what we were doing was new tech with assistance from overseas componentry and so on. I remember we had these bonding machines that you welded a little PIN diode structure onto something that you could physically pick up. And these things, when you put them under the microscope, they fitted inside one of the grooves of your fingerprint. And they were not cheap. They came in a bottle full of oil so they wouldn't blow away. And one day somebody lost one, and I tell you, trying to find one of those on the floor was a challenge. We never found it. Somewhere up there in the dust.
Where did you go from Telstra?
Well, Telstra
Telecom.
sort of, telecom morphed around us. It had a lot of different areas. So the early days were in field maintenance, and in those days switching equipment, telephony, switching equipment and so on. And then changing into support systems for the network. And so real-time monitoring and alarm analysis, fault prediction, control, action to fix, all those sorts of things. So telecom tended to have enough breadth and depth to provide opportunities for lots of different areas.
Were you still there when digital exchanges started to come in, or was it still an analog world?
The early days of those were the trunk switches. Down at Windsor, we had a 10C, which was a digital machine, but the technology wasn't ready for the local telephony network. It was too early for that. So they would bring it in gently. They'd say, well, we'll replace the analyzers, call analyzers were replaced. And then we'll tentatively put in a switch, but we'll have cross switches with electronic control. And it was a slow process towards that. And then there were all of these OSPAT networks coming up and what were true digital switching. 10C was another hybrid, but there were a lot of technologies that were pretty mechanical. And you wondered why, because at the time you knew that the capability was there to make them fully digital, but that wasn't in production. So you went and bought your crossbar switch, and you went and got your category analyzer, and we were pretty much sold on the prowess of Ericsson in those days in Telstra.
And you moved on from there. Where did you go?
I did. The shift from Telstra, because it was Telstra by then, was into the similar technical areas, was Siemens, a German company. And in Australia, they were lucky enough to be an independent, an LC, a local company with some degree of autonomy. There's two arrangements. You can be an agency or you can be an LC. And the commercial arrangements with the parent companies are slightly different. But we had the independence, so we could do a few things. With them, I came in to what would have been all of the network technologies. So we were doing what was based on the internet technologies of today. So all of the digital broadband switching, the stacked fibre technologies for communications, the telephony was there, the links, radio links and wireless, no satellite. We didn't do satellite in those days. But Siemens was not boldly into a lot of those areas. My job was business development. So we looked at getting business into backplane digital networks, bringing in the telephony switches. Siemens makes everything, rather large, but they weren't in switched, we'll call it switched telephony, your house phones. They weren't into that at the time. And so we brought that in, and their approach to it is, would you like a telephone network? Certainly, here it is. And the whole thing's packaged up, and it's got instruction manuals in every language of the world, and it's complete right down to the last thing in the box when you've assembled your $50 million telephone exchange is a squirt bottle of cleaner and a rag to wipe your fingerprints off the door when you shut it.
Typical German efficiency.
Oh, very, very, very good. And yeah, lots of interesting stuff there. GSM, in those days, it was the 800.
In those days, they were cellular radio.
So, well, they started the cellular and did a bit of work there. I came up with what I call the micro cell, although these days I don't think they do that. We had some new tech there, and they were very supportive in Germany for that, which was amazing.
Actually, they're still using microcells.
Yeah, well, it was going through the process of the embedded microprocessor architectures, because prior to that it was pretty big and heavy and clunky, and a cell phone base station occupied a significant room in a telephone exchange, and we'd got it down to having 2 base stations in something that you could hang on the back of a door. Because I took one in those days I was not Telstra, remember. I was on the other side of the table. And so I took one in to the guy who ran the Telstra network and bolted it to the back of his door and said, I've got a prototype there for you to try. He said, where is it? I said, it's on the back of your door. He shut his door and said, brilliant. That was up in Collingwood, I remember. Anyway, stories.
Where did you go from there?
There was always a parallel channel for technology development. These companies were not technology creators and innovators and developers so much as purveyors of product and profit. So there was always a backstream of developing stuff.
Within the company, or was that separate from you?
No, that's outside the companies. In a lot of cases, I used to identify it to the company and say, these are my declared areas, because you're coming up with intellectual property and you want to make sure you're not competing with them, or that they're not getting upset that you're going outside your employment arrangements. So you go to them and say, well, I'm doing this and this. And they say, oh, that's fine, as long as you declare it. So there was a bit of that going on. And so at the end of that, it got to the point where the technologies that I'd done in the audio field had got to the point of being able to be productized. So you have technology has to be created and matured, encouraged, and then put into products, and then products need to be taken forward towards market and so on. So a lot of the early products were about ready to be assembled. So I put up a few shingles and got a few mates together. I think they got me together and I got them together, and we started designing and making audio equipment.
It sounds like you had experience that was leading to this development. You started out with a skill base, obviously. You then moved into manufacturing, your experience with Telecom and Telstra. Then you moved into technology, marketing and market development. And then you started developing products that put all of those things together into creating a new product. Would that be a reasonable summary?
There's a bit missing.
What's that?
Before you actually create a product, you've got to create the technologies, and that is an area that is not necessarily understood. A lot of these product developments are basically integration. You're not developing a new tech. I'll try and give you an example while I'm frantically thinking of it, but you say, well, I've got a platform of technology, or I've got a platform of manufacturing capability, but those are all existing. You haven't created those. They're there, and you're just integrating it and getting it out to market, and your main concerns then are channel to market and deliveries and warehousing and that sort of stuff. But in the case of the true startup, the mass acoustic startup, you're actually creating the technology before you package it up. And that was some of the issues that we had with the new acoustics work, which you came up with the idea, you analysed it, you either scrapped it because it didn't work, or you scratched your head and said, oh yeah, this will work, and you got it to work, and you produced a bit of software and programs to model it, and it seemed to be okay. And then you've got to start on the process of, well, how do we package this? What do we put this into?
Let's go back a step. How did you come up with the ideas in the first place?
Good question. It always just seemed logical to me. People see a passing parade of products. They don't necessarily think about how or where or when those products came from. So the example I've given is you buy yourself a rose plant and it's susceptible to black spot or mildew or some other dreaded disease, and so you don't buy it. But has anybody ever asked why that particular species is susceptible to that and that other species isn't susceptible? And surprisingly, the answer often is no. They just know that if they select that product or that rose, it doesn't have that problem that one does, so we won't have that one. So we forego the benefits of some of the rather beautiful ancient perfumed roses. In the case of the technologies, it's a similar sort of thing. You come up with a technology approach and you just take that. You don't necessarily question what's behind that. But I used to question what's behind that. You know, there's an interface between your ears and the thing that's making a noise, and that's called, you might call it the transmission medium, but most people would call it air. That is just totally ignored. Nobody thinks about the fact that there is a complete level of delivery between you and the thing that makes a noise. And then you say, well, how does that work? And so you have to go through the process of analysing that. And then, well, let's go to the next step. How will we synthesise a better way of doing that? Not necessarily in terms of the device that made the noise. You need that. And I did, and I still do work on that. But how does it get to you? And what influence does the room have? And can you control that? Can you manage that as part of a delivery process? Similar sort of thing. Nobody worries about it. They just say, oh, I'll get another room.
That's not always the answer, and your 3D stereophony seems to go down that path.
Looking at how waves propagate. And in parallel with all of that, telecommunications, let's get it back into the audio and acoustics side.
It's the telecommunications and transmission line theory that underpin that. You have an understanding of that from your telecommunications experience.
You did, but very, very simply. And I could probably say that heavy side would have been probably horrified. But the initial stuff that I did with Greg Campbrell was very simple. It was just like a pipe full of air that was like a transmission line for electrical signals. It was just a guided media. And then all of the theory of transmission lines for their stability and their power reflection and transmission and their attenuation, all of that could be stolen, I suppose, but could be applied to guided media. So here we have a structure and we'd like sound to go in one end of it and we'd like sound to come out the other end of it. How do we shape that structure so that we get the right efficiency, bandwidth, velocity, pressure, whatever parameter it is? How do we do that? And it just, to myself and to Greg, it just seemed obvious.
But that's your mathematical background coming out.
It seemed like it to me. It all just seemed obvious, and I've learned that it isn't, but it just seemed obvious. So you'd say, well, why can't we change these devices so that we get the desired transfer function, whether it's efficiency or bandwidth or whatever? How can we get energy from this thing to this thing in the best way? But we're not talking about a loudspeaker necessarily. We're talking about the stuff in between called waves. And waves are just things that propagate through a medium. So the theory that we had for speaker boxes was also applicable to ultrasonics. And it was also applicable to seismic technologies and areas of seismology and other aspects. All of it based on, well, it's a wave, it's propagating, and it's found a discontinuity. What's it going to do? How does it react to that? And it's got lost. And yeah, that was a core thing. And maybe the difficulty was that if you just assume that there isn't anything between you and a sound source, then you don't realise that you need to analyse and work on that particular part. So to me, the loudspeaker box was just part of that process, and the coupling into the room was another part of that process, but the room itself was part of that process. So we were able to say, well, let's get a solver going, and we unashamedly pinched it all from the Berkeley SPICE solvers, which would invert the solution to what would be a difficult problem, and we could perform an analysis that gave you a source and everything in between. And I mean a source in the electrical sense. So part of what was in between was a magnet and a speaker with a coil of wire in it, or an electrostatic transducer. And part of it was a cabinet, and part of it was a transmission duct, and part of it was a room, and part of it was your ear, the whole thing.
The evolution then is starting from Beranek in the 1940s and continuing through to your design that included the head as part of the process.
I've been very, very privileged, and people say, oh, you're just saying that, but it's true. I've been privileged. You get up with your crazy theories and you talk, and you're quite happy for somebody to come on and say, nah, that's complete rubbish, or, oh, have you thought about this? And I've been very lucky because I didn't work with Leo Beranek, but I worked with Neville. And I worked very, very peripherally with Doug Lampard before he passed away. So I was very lucky to have people who weren't closed to new ideas, but were very capable in their own fields. And so we were building a better model. I was taking what they'd done and putting a little bit on top in the spot, and they were adding a bit. And so we were building up a better view of how things actually work. We haven't fully solved that. People people say, oh no, it's all done now, you know. Everything that can be patented has been patented. It's not true.
Okay, you've been a student, you've been an employee, you've worked in business, and you're now taking the step to go out on your own. What was that like?
Well, your fundamental platform is risk minimisation, so you've got to make sure you're risk minimising. What was it like? Well, we went into those things with a clear objective to achieve a market sector with a product. We were hitting multiple market sectors because the base technologies applied to different areas. It was waves and acoustics. There was a bit of other electronics in there, but it was waves and acoustics that was a key part of it. And as I said, that was going into automotive because there are waves in engines, and it was going into seismic studies, and it was going into loudspeaker devices and design. So going into different areas, and each one of those, you couldn't just say, well, we solved equations for waves and therefore the world is our oyster. You had to apply it to products. So you had to come up with a loudspeaker, and that meant you had to have an amplifier, and you needed filters, and you needed electronics. And then you'd apply it to design of engines, automotive engines. And you could not start using the dialogue and the syntax and of audio to the automotive guys. And similarly, you couldn't start talking to speaker people about car engines. They wouldn't understand it. And the wave part of it was foreign, totally foreign.
To everybody?
I think so. I still wonder.
I do too.
The automotive problem was we've got, and this is in the days before the electric vehicles became more and more dominant. We had an internal combustion engine. We still do. And in that, you design it because you know that water flowing down a channel will get upset if it's a rough channel or if it's got disturbances. So that is what is applied to the gas going into an engine. And that is also what's applied to the gas coming out of an engine. And it's all got to be smooth and nice curves and everything. What is completely overlooked is every single turn of that engine, the flow is totally stopped by a valve and can go nowhere. But that's just overlooked. We just want the flow to be smooth going through. And then when it shuts, well, we'll just ignore that. But it's really not about smooth flow so much as power rejection and transmission, acoustic power rejection and transmission.
Which is a transmission line.
But a lot of the engine stuff is really subsonic flow. So your speeds are 340 metres per second or less. And it's very predictable once you think about it in terms of energy, reflected and forward power.
Which is a transmission line model.
Well, yes, and a fair bit of maths with a bit of coaching from my lecturers and so on. Thank you.
Yeah. So you develop a business. What other skills do you need apart from the engineering side of it?
Well, there's four aspects of a company. You've got to have somewhere that you develop products, somewhere where you manufacture them, somewhere where you flog them, somewhere where you store them. So we had to learn a bit about that. Business skills. You've got to have a process that's documented, because you're going to have to design, manage, sell, moderate, repair, and so on. So you need the full suite.
Did you get any formal training in business, like an MBA or something?
Not really, no. Self-taught, I think I'd have to say. I did have various sessions that were covering aspects of that. For instance, I did some brief training in Berkeley on entrepreneurship and marketing and so on. So there was a bit of that formalism. Business studies, a bit of that here with the Melbourne School. But not formally sitting down and saying we're going to do a 3-year undergrad program in business administration or taxation law or accounting. Or
if it's anything like my training, it would have been built into the undergraduate program as part of a business studies component.
Well, yes, the early days that you were lucky enough to get what would be a multidiscipline approach to it, so you got a bit of everything.
I think that it's still part of an engineering degree that you get some business training as part of it.
I like to hope it is. There wasn't any formal undergraduate programs in that. But part of the process of education is preparing yourself for whole of life learning. And I was very much convinced that was important and still is. So the engineer says that 1/8, or whatever it is, 63 or 65% of what you learn will be gone and obsolete in 18 months. So you've got to understand you've got to keep advancing and refreshing.
There's been some discussion in the press lately that schools haven't been turning out job-ready graduates. Do you think that's a part of their role? And do you think there's another way of developing the skill set?
Well, there's two aspects. You can teach somebody how an LM348 can be used in a circuit, and here's the manual. Or you can teach them the fundamentals of semiconductor device and get them to design a 349. And they are two definite skills, but they're different. And you need both. You need people who understand a particular piece of equipment or model, and therefore can assemble it and can operate it and can maintain it and can repair it and so on. In parallel with that, there was still all of the simultaneous development of technologies. That was always going on. There was always something going on. So it wasn't just, I've gone into education and I've abandoned technology. It was always there. I wasn't employed directly and wholeheartedly in communications, but I was certainly involved in the technologies behind those. Always learning, still am.
So essentially you're saying that your degree sets you up for lifelong learning and that you're moving on to other things using personal professional development.
It makes it hard for employers because how do you assess somebody as suitable for a job? It's easy to say the job is an accountant and therefore I need somebody with an accountancy degree. And that's clear cut. Or it's a bridge designer, I need somebody with a bridge designing degree. But if you don't have guidelines based on an educational qualification and a piece of paper, you then have the difficult task of having to evaluate the suitability of anybody to do a job. And that's a lot harder than just saying, oh, well, we'll take a person who's a graduate. It can be far more rewarding, but it's a lot harder. And then some employees don't do that. Some employees don't have to do that.
Well, there are a number of people who've spent a lifetime learning, building up their skills without the benefit of a university degree. They have gone to work, they've built their skills over periods of 5 years or more in the workplace, and they've come out with a set of skills that is not much different from what would have been started with a degree. But the degree was there to provide the foundation for that lifelong learning and to speed the way along the process. They have the experience. The degree just shortens the time to get started on that path. In addition to providing a few basic skills to understand the industry that you have an interest in, which is a function of the basic degree.
That's the core point that you're dissecting or bisecting, I suppose, because you're saying that on the one hand, you need to learn about specific now technologies. If you want to make something, you need to know what would be the pieces you'd assemble for that. But at the other side of it, you've got to have the more general situation where you've been taught how to learn. So you can actually continue on for the rest of your life.
Is one more important than the other, or are they both equal outcomes?
look, if you've got an hour for a philosophical discussion, well, you need both. You need both. I probably felt, maybe inappropriately, but felt that you spent most of your year learning and a little bit of it towards the end studying for exams.
In your experience, you've covered the process of growing up from post-war environment and to become a consummate professional. Have your business interests been important to you, and have they been satisfying to you?
Everything in life is a balance, isn't it? I did it because I wanted to, and I did it because I had to. Yes, I did both. Yes. Tomorrow, a problem will arise. I don't know what it is.
And you would solve it?
I'll have a go at it, and if I need expertise, I'll go and seek it. But I've learned how to evaluate. I've learned how to analyse. I've learned how to judge when I'm way in over my head. I've learned how to tackle some things to a point. You know, it's all part of life. It doesn't matter whether you're making a cake or discovering a new continent or something. Well, we've run out of continents, haven't we?
When we started, you started talking about soggy anodes and valve technology, and now we're working with microchips that fit on the head of a pin. Has your experience over that time been a positive and worthwhile change?
Yes, totally. There is a fair dose of commercialisation in product now. So if you look at what's available to you, if you want to pursue a career, you're going to be forced into making product decisions more so than technology decisions. But behind that, there are still technology decisions that need to be made. I was very lucky, very, very lucky in choosing Monash for a whole lot of reasons, but one of them in particular was Ed Cherry and his mate from Melbourne University, Dr. Hooper, they had the universal charge control theory. And what that meant was, just as I viewed gas propagation as something that was common to earth wave propagation and sky wave and ultrasonics and all of that, engines, they viewed this as a controlling charge and a controlled charge. And when you put them together, they interact to produce a result. You need that level of disassembly of that whole process so that you can then say, well, I've implemented this in a valve or a tube, but it's just a controlling charge and a controlled charge. I've now implemented it in a semiconductor device, a field effect transistor or bipolar or whatever you want, but it's still a controlling charge and a controlled charge. So suddenly your basic learning is applicable to all of these different fields. So when somebody comes up with a new clever transistor, you say, oh, that's pretty good. You know, you invented the double triac or something. But equally, when somebody comes up with something that's a bit dodgy, you can get a better idea of whether that could be valid or not. So, and that was very useful for Monash through Ed's charge control theory. Just basically how a device that switches or controls or amplifies fundamentally has to work.
If we look now to the future beyond your life, what advice would you give your 12-year-old self or some other person thinking about starting a career, in particular in the audio industry?
Advice. I'm not very good on giving advice, I guess. You've got to encourage those three aspects. You've got to encourage the socialisation. You've got to encourage the technology. You've got to encourage the personal physical skills development. So a balanced diet. I'd say get a balanced diet. Sure, you can go and get some cognitive stuff, but you also need some interpersonal skills and you need physical skills. Get a balance. Some people have natural aptitude, so take that into account. I can't go to everybody and say, I've got the universal panacea for everybody will benefit by this particular approach, because different people have different skill sets and different people have different abilities and so on. I see a lot of 11 to 12-year-old commitment to interpersonal skills through a screen, and that is a meeting of technology and a little bit of physical psychomotor skill, but the affective domain stuff is a bit lacking there. So it's a balanced diet. That's why. So I guess I'd say that. I'm not going to say to somebody, get a job in the bank because there's no future in electronics. I'm not going to say that. I find rather than telling people what to do, you ask them a question, you say, why did it do that? What made that happen? Well, that didn't work. Why? Why didn't it work? And a lot of people say, oh, I don't care. I'll go and get another one. But I give these talks and I say you need 3 aspects for success in your life. You need vision, you need capability, and you need commitment. And they are the 3 pillars that I have for success in this world. Do you have a vision? What are you trying to do? What do you want to do? Do you have a vision? Do you have the capabilities? If you don't have the capabilities, go and get them. Go to the local, go and listen to somebody, go and ask some questions, go and get a degree, go and do some training. And then, are you prepared to commit? Even when it all goes a bit not quite how you thought it would, are you going to still be there? Those are the 3 pillars that I would philosophically offer: vision, capability, and commitment.
It's a very good place to end now. Thank you for our little chat today, and thank you for the time we spent together.
Thanks, Rod, for taking me down a path.
Thank you for participating.